Welcome to Economic Development Unravelled. When India became independent and a republic, the fledgling nation and its leaders dreamed of seeing a prosperous India on par with the West. The Indian leaders in the upper echelons of power envisioned a goal to transform the new nation from illiteracy, backwardness, and extreme poverty into a prosperous one. But the strategy, the methods, and the decisions taken by them were absurd. The poor understanding of the macroeconomy prevalent among the economic community, even to this day, especially when it comes to the economics of the transformation of a developing nation, meant that India was on an ill-fated journey all the way through. The country was navigating its course on an uncharted water. The result was an expected disaster. It is no secret that India has failed to develop rapidly and close the gap with the Western world in science and engineering, infrastructure, and income levels. Today, with an annual income per capita of just $2,000, the nation sits in the World Bank's lower middle income category. In this video, we'll look into how India can transform itself from one of a slowly developing nation to a rapidly developing one, and the strategy which can successfully pull the nation into the developed nations league and close the gap with the West. We'll not be going into the history of Indian economy since it gained independence or the missteps that Indian government made, which stifled the economic growth and development prospects of the fledgling nation. Before we jump into the main topic, it is very helpful to understand the concept of national wealth. If you have already watched my separate video on national wealth, you can skip the video to the 5th minute. If you have not, continue the video as it is. The best way to measure a country's national wealth is in relative sense to its national income. National wealth, or national capital, both one and the same, can be measured as a percentage of its national income. This relation is nothing but a nation's capital-income ratio. Capital-income ratio is a simple accounting concept that indicates a country's total net national wealth stock in market prices as a proportion of its annual national income, also compiled in market prices at the end of a year. Income measurement corresponds to the year in question, and net wealth stock corresponds to aggregate wealth accumulated by the country from time immemorial to the end of the year. That way of measuring is a much better way of gauging national wealth. That is because the total value of a nation's wealth on its own does not convey any meaning and does not capture the magnitude of the wealth stock. A small country such as Singapore has a wealth of $1,100 billion, whereas India has a wealth of $3,450 billion in 2015. Those figures do not tell us which country is wealthier among the two. Wealth per adult in 2015 for Singapore comes to $270,000 compared to $4,350 for India. On a per adult basis, relative figures enable us to infer that Singapore is significantly wealthier than India. But the per adult figures are less useful in terms of analyzing a nation's macroeconomic conditions such as its growth rates and savings rates, which are key to determining future wealth and income creation. To put it simply, capital income allows us to link a nation's annual growth and annual savings to its total wealth and annual income. More on this in a separate video. And for that reason, it is capital income ratio rather than wealth per adult that better enables us to capture the relative wealth at national level and allows us to study wealth on a temporal and spatial level. Typically, low-income countries have a small capital income of the order of less than 200%, which indicates that those countries rely to a much lesser extent on physical capital for output production. Less capital per worker means less than optimal output, thus the low income. Advanced, capital-intensive economies rely heavily on physical capital, accumulated over a long period, as a factor of production. More capital per worker means efficiency and higher output, henceforth their high-income status. Capital-income ratio, as a simple measure of wealth or capital, can be used to compare and contrast wealth accumulated by nations and also to study the dynamics of convergence along the same lines between the less wealthy countries and the wealthy ones. In simple terms, a wealthy, high-income country will have a higher capital-income ratio, equivalent to and more than 4 times its national income. In this section, we'll visualize the key indicators of India and China that can reveal a lot using only a few important macro parameters such as national income and investment. First, let's start with population of the two nations, India and China. This chart shows the total population of India and China from 1981 to 2021. Size-wise, the two nations are mostly similar, and they are by far the biggest in the world in terms of population. India has lagged China by a couple hundred million, but the South Asian nation is projected to overtake China as early as 2023. Now, let's look at the percentage of working-age population of India and China from 1960 to 2021. This data gives us an idea of the size of working people comprising the overall population. They had a similar working-age population until 1976, and since then India has slightly lagged China on this metric. What has this gigantic working-age population produced in India and China? Let's take a look. While India and China enjoyed similar GDP in current US dollars in 1981 at roughly $195 billion each, China paced ahead since then. China grew at astounding annual GDP growth rates throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. To reach $1 trillion in GDP, it took China the next 17 years from 1981. India, 26 years. To hit $2 trillion in GDP, it took China and India just 7 years each after that. To hit $3 trillion in GDP, China took just another 2 years, while it took India another 7 years. India currently enjoys a GDP of roughly $3 trillion in 2021. But China has grown much faster. After it hit $3 trillion in 2007, the nation reached a new trillion mark every year since then, enjoying the world's second largest economy with a GDP of $17.7 trillion in 2021. Today, China's GDP is 5.5 times larger than India's. This massive difference in the GDP sizes of these two nations is because of the huge difference in their growth rates. When we look at this GDP per capita growth charts, it is obvious that China's growth levels were much higher. The country was operating at a higher economic stratosphere. During the 31-year period from 1981 to 2021, China's growth rates in most of the years operated within a range having a bottom at around 7%. Whereas India operated within a range having a top figure around 7%. What explains this gigantic difference between the evolution of these two Asian countries? What propelled China's GDP to stratospheric heights? There is a lot we'll learn when we look at the data of how much each nation is investing. For a start, let's check how much each nation is making gross fixed capital investment. India and China made $38 billion and $53 billion respectively in fixed capital investment in 1981. Ever since, China has pulled off a miraculous feat, investing tens of billions of dollars in new capital every year in the 1980s to hundreds of billions of dollars in the 1990s and 2000s to trillions of dollars in the 2010s. China is projected to have made more than $6.5 trillion in new capital in 2021. On the other hand, India's modest gross capital investment means the nation is yet to surpass $1 trillion, as the South Asian nation has made $900 billion in gross investment in 2021. The same story applies to each nation's net domestic investment, which is nothing but gross fixed capital investment minus depreciation capital expenditure. Net domestic investment, which represents the net new capital or net new wealth created, is a figure that is of paramount importance because it is this macroeconomic parameter alone that is by far the single biggest factor determining how much a given nation's economy has expanded or grown during a given year. Here, both India and China have grown consistently in the beginning, but India's net domestic investment hasn't kept up pace in the same manner as China's, which has eclipsed into trillions of dollars. Looking at these main macroeconomic indicators, it is not a surprise that India's national income per capita lags that of China by a wide margin. While China is projected at well over $8,000 in national income per capita in 2021, India has crossed the $2,000 mark in income per capita for the first time in 2021. There is obviously a wide gap between the main economic indicators of India and China. Even though India is lagging China, the South Asian nation is catching up China eventually. But the economic development pace of India is much slower compared to that of China. The amount of new wealth, the single biggest factor to track when it comes to the progress made by the developing nations, created by China during its peak growth over the past 4 decades is extraordinarily high. The nation kept adding trillions of dollars in new capital and wealth each year during the latter part of 2010s when the economy of the nation became quite big and it began benefiting from its sheer size. What should India do to bridge the gap with China and other Western nations to become a developed nation? To close the gap with China, India needs to massively up the pace of how much it invests in new capital each year. That means it needs to increase the size of its net domestic investment. Economists have long failed to understand the workings of the macroeconomy and henceforth have also failed at economic development. Based on the groundbreaking research in economics, published in this latest book, The General Theory of Rapid Economic Development, we finally have the ultimate resource as to what a developing country needs to do to get on the development curve. Let's now quickly get on to what India needs to do to transform itself rapidly. India needs a metamorphosis in the manufacturing activity during the development period. That is, the country has to first start with light industry manufacturing and then move to heavy industry because the former is easier and faster to begin and to kickstarting the rapid capital accumulation process. And importantly, light industry can steer the transformation of a less developed economy with a small national income to a ready-to-industrialize economy with a comparatively larger national income. This enables India to take advantage of compound growth rates of large numbers, as was the case with China. By building its light industry manufacturing first, China's national income in 2002 when it re-entered into heavy industry had jumped to more than 6 times of what the national income was when the nation decided to focus on light industry instead of heavy industry in the early 1980s. Beginning with light industry manufacturing is the key since light industry, combined with growing exports, expands national income to a size that can provide savings large enough for heavy industry investment and a market large enough to create demand. With the manufacturing metamorphosis on track, India needs to follow and implement 4 economic policy mechanisms, 2 each under industrial policy and trade policy. Under industrial policy, there are 2 policy mechanisms, industry promotion and frontier technology transfer. Under trade policy, there is the export promotion and targeting, and import tariffs enforcement. Moving to the first policy mechanism, industry promotion. This mechanism enables India to accumulate final goods heavy industry. It works by the way of the government promoting industries to existing businesses and private individuals. In practice, the government can utilize banks to create policy loans in order to promote heavy industries. Policy loans come with subsidized interest rates and are channeled for business investment in final goods heavy industries. Second, frontier technology transfer. This mechanism enables India to acquire frontier technology, meaning cutting-edge technology, across various industries from abroad. The final goods heavy industries in India will benefit from the cutting-edge technology that can be acquired under various means and methods. The mechanism works by way of the government promoting a voluntary transfer of frontier technology from the global corporations based in the industrialized nations to Indian manufacturers. In practice, the government can deploy business income tax and many other channels to influence Indian manufacturers to have them acquire and absorb frontier technology from the developed nations. Typically, the government can incentivize both the frontier technology provider and the acquirer through various channels, including the offer of favorable business income taxes. Third, export promotion and export targeting. The export promotion and export targeting mechanism is to promote the exports of goods in general and target final goods heavy industry products for export in particular. The mechanism of export targeting is a subset of the mechanism of export promotion. In practice, the mechanism takes the form of trade industrial policy through which the governments of developing nations use the channels of taxation to promote and target products for export. The usual levers are export VAT rebate plans or export performance rewards. The way this mechanism works is by implementing a uniform VAT tax system applicable to all businesses within the country. It is something similar to the currently existing GST tax system. Normally, all businesses pay the flat VAT tax to the government. But under the export promotion mechanism, that amount is refunded to all those businesses that export goods and services. The refund is applicable to just the portion of goods that were exported and not to the goods sold in the domestic market. At the same time, not all goods that gets exported receive the same full refund. Under the export targeting mechanism, the capital goods segment, that is, the machinery and equipment and their parts, receive a higher, or full, refund. The purpose of these mechanisms is to promote merchandise exports in general and especially target the capital goods industry to compete in foreign markets by incentivizing exports. The fourth one, the Imports Tariffs Enforcement Mechanism. This mechanism is to enforce import tariffs on consumer goods and promote imports of capital goods. In practice, the mechanism takes the form of trade policy through which government uses the levers of taxation to regulate the sort of goods entering the country. What happens when India switches the modus operandi? India's policy of exports promotion and exports targeting will work to incentivize exports, which will increase the share of exports in GDP going forward. An ever-increasing exports rate means that the nation can use the exports earnings to purchase foreign machinery and equipment and other capital goods raw materials from foreign nations. That will automatically raise the nation's net domestic investment rate and also its savings rate. India will then witness a surge in the savings rate simultaneous to a surge in exports rate. The same way it has happened with China, as we can see in this chart, an ever-increasing exports rate year after year concurrently rose the nation's savings rate. Likewise, the build-up of savings rate along with exports rate observed with India in the past will evolve to new heights, from the low 20% to 40% and above at some point. Whatever the shortfall we have previously observed with net domestic investment rate for India in comparison with China will vanish and India's rate will move several notches up. India has historically lagged China in the savings rate parameter. By following the policy mechanisms, India will rapidly inch towards the higher rates, made possible by an ever-increasing exports rate which was the central parameter that India needed to correct. The lag in the value that India had with China in GDP per capita incomes will also trim as India inches toward higher investment rates and subsequently much higher annual GDP growth rates. Because the source of a majority of China's new capital investment made inside the country lies with the massive Chinese external savings, which is a result of its massive exports as we can see from this chart showing for each year from 1981 to 2020. External savings outpace internal savings and contribute enormously towards capital investment and growth of the nation. By undertaking the policy actions as covered in this video, India will witness immediate surge in production output, driven by the incentive to produce quality products for exports and consequent improvement in purchasing power to import machinery and equipment, which then raises the net domestic investment rates and GDP growth rates. All this means India's capital income ratio, a central parameter to track economic development progress, will rise rapidly. And that is how India can become a developed nation. That's it for today. If you want to learn more about the content in this video, and learn those concepts in much more detail, get your copy of the recently released The General Theory of Rapid Economic Development book on Amazon. You will find the link in the description below. Hit the thumbs up button if you like this video. Send your thoughts to me in the comments section. Subscribe to this channel to watch more quality content like this.